Okay, so this is not going to be a very long talk. Hopefully it'll be useful. I'm Danielle. I'm a software engineer at a company called Nift based in Boston. And I'm actually going to start this talk by changing the title. Originally, I decided to call it Webpacker versus the Asset Pipeline. But as I continue to do research for this talk, I realize it's not really just Webpacker versus the Asset Pipeline. It's more like Webpacker versus no Webpacker, or Webpacker versus the Asset Pipeline plus some other Rails stuff. Because honestly, what this talk is really about is like what it's like to use a Rails app with Webpacker and without. It's honestly not even a versus thing because I don't think there's going to be a winner at the end. It's more of a what you're going to prefer, and I just really want you to see what to expect when you pick one over the other. So because Webpacker is a wrapper around Webpack, which is something that you use with JavaScript applications, I decided to use Vue.js. So we're going to see a lot of examples that use .vue files, and a .vue file is going to look like this. And I know that's really small, and you don't really need to be able to read it. I just want you to know that a Vue file is going to kind of consist of 3 different parts. You're going to have your template part up here, which is just HTML. You're going to have your JavaScript part here, and your CSS part. And of course, the order of this does not matter. This is just what I happen to put it in. So what is the asset pipeline? When you go to the Ruby guide, it says the asset pipeline provides a framework to concatenate and minify or compress JavaScript and CSS assets. And we've all started a new Rails app, right? And we've all seen this, something similar to this in our application.js file. And this is where we are just importing either a subtree of folders or we're importing another file and concatenating it to this current file. And this is all taken care of by Sprockets, and that's the gem that actually implements the asset pipeline. Similarly, in our Sass files, we've seen these import statements. We've concatenated other CSS files to our current Sass file. And of course, we've also seen fingerprinting where our assets have a fingerprint added so that it can make caching easier. So we know that Sprockets can handle this. What you may not know is Sprockets can be extended. And we can extend it by adding processors, transformers, compressors. And there are a lot of resources I use to kind of research some of this. That URL down there is one of them. I definitely urge you to look at that. It'll give you more information. But we're going to focus on these 3. There's also one more called exporters, and that just writes to the file system, but we're not going to really talk about that very much. So we're going to start with transformers. And transformers, what they really do is they change one file type into another. So when you think about like a CoffeeScript file, a .coffee file, the CoffeeScript processor is just going to change that .coffee file into a JS file. And if you ever get a chance to look at different source codes, like the TypeScript source code, you can see there at the bottom line where it's registering the MIME type text TypeScript with the extension .ts, and also registering a transformer that changes the TypeScript file to a JavaScript file using the TypeScript Rails transformer. So that's essentially what a transformer does. It's going to change one file to a different file type. So like when you have a Sass file, that the default transformer is going to change that Sass file to a CSS file. So after transformers, we have processors. And there are 2 types of processors. There are preprocessors and postprocessors. And preprocessors are run when the file is loaded. Postprocessors are run after transformers. And if you remember these lines that we've talked about that are in application.js, that is actually handled by a preprocessor. A preprocessor called the directive processor. That's the processor that's in charge of actually loading those files and concatenating it. So another example of a postprocessor then would be Autoprefixer. And if you don't remember what Autoprefixer does, Autoprefixer takes CSS like this and expands it into that. And this just makes it so that it's compatible with all browsers and things like that. So we've seen pre-processors and post-processors. And after that, of course, we have compressors. And compressors are exactly what they sound like. They make your file smaller. So uglifier would be a compressor. Anything that reduces your file, removes white space, is going to be a compressor. So great. We've seen how we can extend sprockets by adding processors, transformers, and compressors. And now we're going to take a look at Webpack. So as we said before, Webpacker is just a Rails wrapper around Webpack. And if you go to the Webpack website, they themselves say that Webpack is a static module bundler for modern JavaScript applications. And I don't know about you, but even though, yeah, this definition is very succinct, it means absolutely nothing to me. Like when I read this, I don't really get a definition of what it does. Like it says nothing. What actually gave me a better idea of what Webpack does is the image that's on the Webpack homepage. And here you can see that you have JS files that are depending on Vue files, that are depending on other Vue files, and Vue files that are depending on Sass files, that are depending on PNGs and other image files. And you see that Webpacker is taking all of those and compiling it all down into simple static assets. And that's what Webpacker does. It handles all of your dependencies for you. All you need to say is, my file depends on these things. And these files depend on those things. And Webpacker will handle all of those dependencies for you and make simple static files out of that. So when you're using Webpacker, you're going to see import statements like these. So when you import other things, one of the cool things about Webpack is you can import just about any kind of file into your JavaScript file. So you can import classes and functions and objects from other JavaScript files into your current JavaScript file, and you can even import things like images and CSS into your JavaScript file. So when we're configuring Webpack, we're going to want to start with an entry point. And your entry point is the files that you're going to compile down. These are the files that you're starting with. And usually in our Rails app, this would be like your application.js file. In Webpack, this defaults to app JavaScript's pack, that entire folder. Any file in that folder is an entry point. And again, these files can be anything like Vue and JS files. They could be Sass files and CSS files, and they can also be image files. And from here, we're going to pass them through loaders. And so loaders are like Sprocket transformers, processors, and compressors. Loaders kind of do all of those things. So here we have an example of a loader that works on a Sass file. And the nice thing about these loaders is that you can say like you can specify a regex for it. So here we're saying anything that ends with .sass, we want these loaders to work. And these loaders actually work in reverse order, which a little unintuitive. You would think it would work from the top down, but it actually works from the bottom up. So here we're going to start with our Sass loader. That's going to compile the Sass to CSS file. And then we're going to pass it off to a CSS loader, which is going to interpret all the import statements and their URLs to import other files. And then finally, we're going to go to our star loader, which actually adds the CSS to the DOM. And so when you think about sprockets here, you can see that like our Sass loader would be like a Sprocket transformer. And if we wanted, we could add like an Autoprefixer at the top, so that is the last thing run. And that Autoprefixer would be essentially like a post processor that Sprocket would run. And another loader you're going to see us use right now is a Vue loader. And you remember the Vue file we talked about before. That Vue loader in Webpack is what's going to actually convert this Vue file from a .vue file to actually both a JS file and a CSS file. So again, we have loaders, some example being a Vue loader, the Sass loader, a post CSS loader. And from these loaders, finally, we're going to get to our outputs. So again, by default, it's going to output to your public packs folder. This is where all of your minimized and compressed files are going to be. So from your .vue and JS files, you're going to have JS. From your Sass files, you're going to have your CSS files. And along with that, you're also going to be able to get map files. And these map files are super useful, especially when you're in production and you're trying to debug your JavaScript. Because you're going to have minimized JavaScript files, you could use that map file to map it back to your fully extended file to help you really understand what's going on. So great. We know how Sprockets works. We know how we can extend Sprockets. We know how Webpack works. So now we can start asking some more questions. Where are our assets located? How do we make components? How do we bundle files? How can we handle CSS? And then what do we do at Nift? So we talked before about how, by default, all of your files are going to be placed in app JavaScript packs for entry points. So the entire app JavaScript file is where you're going to actually put all of your files when you're using Webpack. When you're using Webpack, even if it's an image file that you're importing into another JavaScript file, it's still in your app JavaScripts folder, which may feel a little bit weird instead of putting in like the app assets image folder. But yeah, all of your files are going to be in subdirectories of app JavaScript. On the other hand, of course, when you use the asset pipeline, everything is in app assets. Similarly, when you compile down, when your files are compiled and fingerprinted, with Webpack, they're going to be in public packs, as opposed to the asset pipeline where they'll be in public assets. So great, we know where our files are, we know where they'll end up. How do we make components? Again, I'm going to go back to this view file. So here in this view file, we have everything. We have our template, we have our JavaScript, we have our CSS, and Webpack just handles this by itself, right? It just takes care of that. Sprocket, on the other hand, can't handle this because it's just a .view file, but you can extend it with a transformer. You can get, if you can find a .view transformer, you can transform this file from a .view file to a JavaScript file or a .view file to a CSS file. And of course, like every Ruby programmer knows, there's probably a gem for that. And of course, there is a Rails view loader gem, and we could use this gem to do that compilation for us. But what if there isn't a Sprocket transformer? What if you don't want to make one yourself? Because frankly, it takes a lot of time. In that case, you can use a Rails view partial file. And this might make some people feel uncomfortable putting your JavaScript with your HTML, like at least like this with script tags. But you can do this. There is usually a little bit of a performance hit when you keep importing Rails view partials. But you can also cache this, and it's easy to cache because nothing here depends on user data. This is just static HTML and JavaScript. Great, so we know how to write our components. How do we actually bundle everything up properly? So from the top level, when you're including your JavaScript links and your CSS links, it's actually pretty similar to when you do it with Sprockets. Instead of saying JavaScript include tag, you do JavaScript pack tag, and instead of doing style sheet link tag, you do style sheet pack tag. But more specifically, let's say we're using a view Sprocket transformer after all. One thing you have to make sure to do is, because even though you're using that view transformer, that view Sprocket transformer, you need to make sure you add it in two places. You have to add that view file to whatever JavaScript file is going to carry that JavaScript text. And you also need to add that component view file to your CSS file. You have to add that import statement twice. If you only add it once, like if you only add that require to your JavaScript tag and to your JavaScript file and you don't add it to your CSS file or to your Sass file, you won't get any of the styles. So you have to add it in both places. Webpack, on the other hand, does not work like that. Webpack is honestly a little bit easier in this sense. We've talked about export and import a little bit, where we said how you can import just about any type of object into a JavaScript object, or if you could just use anything as an entry point and you can say you could import anything there. So we can actually take advantage of these exports and imports to import our components anywhere. So just a little bit of an overview of import and export. If you don't export something from a JavaScript file, you can't use it in a different file. And if you want to export the entire file, you can just put it in your export brackets. But I think another important part, another part that's super powerful, is the ability to export multiple things. With export, so in this example, we have foo.js, and we're exporting 3 things. But we also have a bar.js that imports just one of those things. And this is super powerful. For example, let's say we have an application.js file. And that application.js file imports file 1 and file 2. And each of those files, both of those files, import from this one file, other file. Webpack because Webpack in the background builds a dependency graph of everything, In your static file, in the compiled file, it's only going to have it's only going to have the code snippet from other file.js once. And because Sprockets concatenates, if you just import it the regular way with Sprockets, it's going to add those lines twice. So that's one thing that's also super powerful about Webpack. Webpack always adds unique dependencies, and Sprockets just concatenates. So you have the potential to add the same lines multiple times. Great, so we have some ideas about how to bundle our files. How do we handle CSS? CSS in Webpack is actually pretty simple. Again, because we have these entry points, we can just add CSS there. If we want global CSS, we can always add it to any JavaScript file anywhere where we need it. So adding CSS in terms of Webpack is almost pretty similar to adding it without Webpack. You can still use your Sass import statements. Even when you're in a .view file, you can still use your Sass import statements. So it's pretty much the same. So we know where our assets are located. We know how to make components. We know how to bundle our files. And now we know how to handle CSS. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we choose to do at Nift. At Nift, we actually went more with a Rails view partial method. Most of our pages aren't using JavaScript. We have a lot of static pages, and then we have a few pages that are just super dynamic. And I think this works well for us because we're not having something take over our entire front end. Personally, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do this. I think if you want a full spa, if you want a full single-page app, maybe it does make sense to use Webpack first instead, just because Webpack is going to handle all your dependencies for you. It's made for JavaScript applications. You get to use Node, and let's be honest, Node are going to get those JavaScript updates first. But overall, I don't think there's a right and wrong way. I really hope this has been useful, and I will take any questions. Thank you.